The War of the Stray Dog. The War of the Stray Dog was a brief border conflict between Greece and Bulgaria that occurred in October 1925. The incident, sometimes called the Incident at Petrik, arose from a seemingly trivial event, but quickly escalated into a military confrontation. The tensions between Greece and Bulgaria had been simmering for some time, largely due to territorial disputes and the aftermath of the Balkan Wars and World War I. Both countries had competing national interests and grievances, especially concerning their shared border in the region of Macedonia. The immediate trigger for the conflict occurred on October 19, 1925, when a Greek soldier crossed the border into Bulgaria while chasing his dog, which had strayed into Bulgarian territory near the town of Petrik. According to one version of events, Bulgarian border guards fired at the Greek soldier, killing him. Another version suggests that the Greek soldier was shot while attempting to cross back into Greek territory. In response, Greece accused Bulgaria of aggression and sent troops across the border. Greek forces quickly occupied several Bulgarian villages, including Petrik, and demanded compensation for the soldier's death. The situation escalated as both countries mobilized their forces, and there was a real risk of a larger conflict developing. The League of Nations, the international organization established after World War I, intervened to prevent further escalation. The League condemned the Greek invasion and called for an immediate ceasefire. It also appointed a commission to investigate the incident and mediate the dispute. Both Greece and Bulgaria agreed to comply with the League's decision. The League of Nations found Greece to be at fault for the invasion and ordered it to withdraw its troops from Bulgarian territory. Greece was also required to pay compensation to Bulgaria for the damages caused by the brief occupation. The crisis was resolved without further bloodshed, and Greek forces withdrew from Bulgaria. The Pastry War. The Pastry War between 1838 and 1839 was a brief conflict between France and Mexico, triggered by a French pastry chef, Raymond Tel, who claimed his shop in Mexico City was looted by Mexican soldiers. When the Mexican government refused to compensate him and other French citizens, France demanded 600,000 pesos. After Mexico declined to pay, France sent a naval fleet, blockading Mexican ports and bombarding Veracruz. The blockade and military actions placed significant pressure on the Mexican economy and government. Unable to counter the superior French forces and facing economic difficulties, Mexico sought mediation. The British helped broker a peace agreement in March 1839. Under the terms of the agreement, Mexico agreed to pay the 600,000 pesos demanded by France, and French forces withdrew from Mexican territory. The Emu War. The Emu War was an unusual and somewhat humorous conflict that took place in Australia in late 1932. The war was essentially a pest control operation carried out by the Australian military against a large population of emus. After World War I, many Australian soldiers were given land in Western Australia to farm. However, by the early 1930s, the Great Depression had hit, and these farmers were struggling with poor soil, drought, and falling wheat prices. To make matters worse, an estimated 20,000 emus migrated from inland areas to the coast, drawn by the conditions on the newly established farms. The emus, finding the farms a source of food and water, began to ravage the crops, causing significant damage and losses for the farmers. In response to the farmers' pleas for help, the Australian government decided to deploy military resources. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was put in charge of the operation, which involved soldiers armed with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The goal was to cull the emu population and reduce the damage they were causing. The campaign began in November 1932, but the emus proved to be surprisingly elusive and resilient. The birds were fast and had an uncanny ability to scatter and evade the machine gun fire. Over several days of attempts, only a small number of emus were killed, while the majority escaped unharmed. The operation became increasingly challenging as the emus quickly adapted to the presence of the soldiers and the weapons. The military operation was eventually called off after a few weeks, with the soldiers having killed only a few hundred emus out of the thousands that were causing problems. The campaign was widely regarded as a failure, and it became a subject of ridicule in the press. The government decided that the emus were too difficult to control using military means, and instead, they offered a bounty system to encourage hunters to cull the birds. The Pig War. The Pig War was a border dispute between the United States and the British Empire over the San Juan Islands, located between Vancouver Island and the mainland United States. The conflict, which lasted from 1859 to 1872, is famously known as the Pig War because it was sparked by the shooting of a pig. The dispute began on June 15, 1859, when an American settler, Lyman Cutler, shot and killed a British pig that was rooting around in his garden. The pig belonged to the Hudson's Bay Company, a British enterprise. Tensions quickly escalated, as both the United States and Britain had competing claims to the San Juan Islands under the terms of the Oregon Treaty of 1846, which had left the boundary between the two nations vaguely defined. In response to the pig's shooting, British authorities threatened to arrest Cutler, prompting American settlers to call for military protection. In July 1859, the United States sent a small military force under the command of Captain George Pickett to the islands. The British responded by sending 3 warships to the area. Despite the military buildup, both sides avoided violence, largely due to the reluctance of local commanders to engage in an armed conflict over such a trivial incident. For the next several years, the dispute continued without any shots being fired, as both nations maintained a military presence on the islands. The situation remained tense, but peaceful. The matter was eventually referred to international arbitration, and in 1872, the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm I was chosen as the arbitrator. He ruled in favor of the United States, granting them control of the San Juan Islands. The Pig War is notable for being a bloodless conflict, with the only casualty being the pig. The Football War. Tensions between El Salvador and Honduras had been building for years, primarily due to economic and social issues. Honduras, a larger but less densely populated country, was experiencing an influx of Salvadoran immigrants, many of whom settled on land in Honduras. These immigrants often faced discrimination and resentment from the local population, particularly as they competed for jobs and resources. In response, the Honduran government began expelling Salvadoran immigrants, further straining relations between the two countries. The immediate trigger for the conflict came in June 1969, during the World Cup qualifying matches. The first match, held in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, ended with violence against the Salvadoran team and their supporters. The situation worsened during the return match in San Salvador, where the Honduran team faced a hostile environment and violence. The tensions reached their peak after a third, decisive playoff match in Mexico City, which El Salvador won, securing their place in the World Cup. On July 14, 1969, just weeks after the soccer matches, El Salvador launched a military offensive against Honduras. The Salvadoran Air Force bombed targets in Honduras, and ground troops crossed the border. The conflict, which lasted for about 100 hours, saw intense fighting, but was relatively short-lived. The Organization of American States, OAS, intervened, calling for a ceasefire, which was agreed upon on July 18, 1969. The war resulted in significant casualties and displacement. Although the conflict was brief, it left a lasting impact on both countries, exacerbating political and social issues. The war also damaged infrastructure and economies in both nations. A formal peace treaty was signed in 1980, more than a decade after the conflict, but the border dispute and underlying tensions persisted for years. The War of the Oaken Bucket. At the time, Italy was divided into numerous city-states, each with its own government and military. These city-states often formed alliances and fought against each other. Modena and Bologna were part of this fragmented political landscape, with Modena generally aligning with the Ghibellines, who supported the Holy Roman Emperor, and Bologna siding with the Guelphs, who were loyal to the Pope. The immediate cause of the war was a raid by Modenese soldiers into Bolognese territory. During this raid, the Modenese reportedly stole a wooden bucket from a well in Bologna. This bucket became a symbolic trophy, representing the animosity between the two cities. However, the theft of the bucket was more of an excuse for the conflict rather than its primary cause. The real issues were political and territorial disputes, along with the long-standing rivalry between the Ghibelline and Guelph factions. The most significant battle of the war was the Battle of Zappolino, fought on November 15, 1325. The Modenese forces, led by Passerino Bonacolsi and supported by allies, clashed with the Bolognese army near the town of Zappolino. The battle was fierce, but the Modenese forces emerged victorious, inflicting heavy losses on the Bolognese. Following their victory, the Modenese briefly occupied some Bolognese territory and carried the captured bucket back to Modena as a symbol of their triumph. Despite the victory, the war did not result in significant territorial changes, and the political situation in the region remained largely the same. The War of the Oaken Bucket is remembered more for its unusual and somewhat comical cause than for its military or political consequences.
you.